Hello, y'all, and welcome to the 13th episode of 10 Years in Bed, a mental health podcast for the mentally ill by the mentally ill. My name is Alison, and I'm your host, and today I am going to talk to you guys about how I became 11 years sober. So I'm going to discuss my journey through addiction and sobriety, and hopefully give you guys some tips that might help you if you're also struggling with addiction. Growing up as a kid, I was very anti-drug. And early on in my life, my parents separated and got divorced between ages 6 and 7. I lived in two very, very, very separate households that did things very differently when I was a kid. At my dad's house, I was doing extra credit book reports, constantly doing homework. If I wanted to watch like a 20-minute Arthur episode, I'd have to read for like an hour and a half. And then my mom's place was a lot more fun. Her and I actually did shit together. We went for dinners a lot. We shopped. We had a good time, and it was a lot more of like a lax environment. So two very separate households, but the one thing that both parents really instilled in me is that drugs were bad. And I was very, very, very anti-drug, anti-smoking, anti-drinking throughout my entire childhood. Now, I didn't know at the time that I was autistic, but I was severely bullied in school. And I never really fit in anywhere until I switched schools. I went from a Catholic school in my dad's neighborhood to a public school in my mom's neighborhood. And it was there that I finally found friends and I found my people. As soon as I got into grade 9, I started at a high school, and some of the friends from my secondary school were there, but I fell into a bad crowd. It all kind of started with like a shotgun at a party, and I don't like it's so stupid. It's like where someone smokes and then they blow the smoke into your mouth. And I remember when it happened, I started crying and freaking out because I was like, oh my God, I was so anti-drugs. I just did drugs. This is crazy. And then a few months later, I got like drunk for the first time. And my friends, and I'm putting air quotes if you're not watching this on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, I use the friends term very lightly here. But the first time that I got drunk, I passed out in a field and my friends left me there. And every time I drank, it was sort of like that, where I was doing everything in such excess that I was blacking out. That summer, I smoked weed with my mom for the first time. And I remember I was in our backyard with her and her friend was like, no, she's done this before. So I like pretended to struggle, but it became a very common occurrence. And it kind of went like this. My mom would get home, and from the time that my mom would get home until the time that we'd go to sleep, we'd smoke weed together and watch movies, eat food, talk, laugh. And it kind of, that like family life kind of led me to believe that doing drugs were okay to a degree. And later that fall, I started working at Aritzia. And this was, I believe, in grade 10, so 2010. And when I worked there, I met a girl who told me about MDMA. And I think it was October 30th, 2010, was the first time that I tried MDMA. And I remember trying it. And I remember the moment it hit me. I was dressed as Lady Gaga for a Halloween party. And I just started jumping up and down. And I was like, this is the feeling that I've been searching my entire life for. And I remember doing it that night. And the next day I said to my friend, like, let's do it again. Like, let's do it. And she was like, no, you need to wait. And I was like, no, I don't want to wait. So I ended up waiting, and we did it the next week. And then I started doing it every single day for months until I ended up going to a children's hospital for trying to kill myself with drugs. And while I was in the hospital, the nurse told me about a very specific strain of MDMA that was going around that made people unable to urinate. So when you're on uppers, you have the tendency to drink water. And people were coming into the hospital internally exploding because they were drinking so much to hydrate, but they could not pee. And I left the hospital and decided the best course of action would be to procure MDMA and do it. And I did that for another few months, but it got to a point where MDMA kind of wasn't functioning for me the same way that it was before. So I moved on to cocaine. And I spent the entire summer of 2011 consuming chili cheese hot dogs from 7-Eleven, bubblegum Slurpees, chicken taquitos, and a fuckload of cocaine. And I have no idea how I survived, but I did. And I continued down that path. And the following fall, I was with some friends, and there were 2 nights. One was a Thursday and one was a Saturday. I can't remember particularly which one. That night, I slipped into drug-induced psychosis because I was doing a pile of speed, MDMA, and ecstasy, and cocaine, and I shaved half my head, thought I was dyeing it blue, but I dyed it red, so I thought that half my head was bleeding. And I was in a bathroom with an old man who was supplying me drugs. And at the time, I was still a child, 16 or 17. And he was, I guess, in his 40s. I'm not too sure. And I remember having no control over my body, over my bodily functions. I'm not particularly sure what happened that night, so that's kind of all I'll say. But I remember the next morning, my dad picking me up and me just, the only words that I could get out were, I need help. And then a few months later, I put myself in rehab for the first time. And that was at 17 years old. I ended up getting kicked out the first 3 times I was in rehab. 4th time was the charm. And I got fully sober the day after I turned 19. And the first 3 times I was in rehab was at the Dave Smith Youth Treatment Center, just outside of Ottawa. And the 4th time was at the Royal Ottawa Hospital, which is a mental hospital here in Ottawa, in a program called Meadow Creek. And you think 3rd time's the charm, but bitch, bestie, 4th time is the charm, at least in my case. The biggest lesson that I had to learn as somebody who was trying to get sober is that I was not able to do any type of drinking or drugs. And I had to become okay with the concept that if I wanted to live a life worth living, that I would never be able to drink or do drugs again. And for me, I could never get behind the concept of one day at a time, which if you're familiar with NA or AA, it is an NA, Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous term. And I guess the notion really there is to just try to get through the day, whatever that looks like for you. And I get that, but in early recovery, it was something that I could never really conceptualize. So I had to get used to the notion that I would just have to live the rest of my life like this. Like I would never be able to just drink or smoke. And it's just something that I had to not only be okay with, but something that I had to welcome in my life, because there was absolutely no way that I could ever use again. What ended up happening is the 4th time that I went into rehab, the day after my birthday, I had been waiting to get accepted into this rehab for like 8 months. And I was frustrated and tired of using. So I put myself in the Ottawa Withdrawal Management Center. It's basically a detox center here in Ottawa. And I went there and I went in on a Monday and I got out on a Thursday. And I remember them calling me on the Thursday and saying, hey, by the way, we've got a bed available for you at Meadow Creek. It will be available in 1 week. And if you guys know anything about addicts and about treatment centers, usually what they'll do, at least in this specific instance for this treatment center, what I've heard that they've done is they'll give people 24 hours notice. Because if you tell an addict that they have 1 week before they go into treatment, they will do so many drugs that they will end up killing themselves. And they called me and told me that they had a bed available for me in 1 week. And during that week, I still stayed sober. And I have been sober ever since. And I just, on April 2nd, celebrated 11 years of sobriety. The biggest reason I can pinpoint that I attribute to Rehab number 4 being the one that stuck is that it was actually in a hospital, which means that it wasn't just counselors that had no fucking clue what they were doing. There were actual doctors there, psychiatrists that had the ability to diagnose me and then put me on meds in order to help treat my diagnoses. I remember when I first got sober and I went to my mom's house and I asked her if she couldn't drink or smoke weed while I was there. And I remember specifically her saying to me, "I'm not going to change my lifestyle to suit your needs." And there's a reason why I'm telling you this, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. The first year of sobriety, I pretty much stayed in my house and I didn't leave. I stayed in my house, I smoked cigarettes. When I left, I went to Pizza to get pizza. I skateboarded, and I pretty much just painted and smoked cigarettes for the first year of sobriety. I did not fucking do anything else because that's what I needed to do in order to get by. One of my friends actually told me that she thought I was agoraphobic for a while, but I digress. Now, the second year of sobriety, that was a little weird. I will not lie. Second year of sobriety, fucking strange on my part. I started hanging out with people that were doing drugs that I didn't even know the name of. And it was like 3 months of me hanging out with people and them doing drugs from 10 in the night till 6 in the morning. And I stayed with them the entire time and just smoked cigarettes and watched them do drugs in front of me. It was a weird move on my part, I will not lie. Shortly after that, I went through a phase where I was clubbing constantly. Well, not necessarily clubbing, but I was going to bars and I would do this thing because I was a server at the time. And this was, I think, about 5 or 6 years into sobriety, where I worked a breakfast shift and I'd have to get there at like 6:30 in the morning. So I'd work and then I'd finish work at like 2 or 3. I'd go home, I'd sleep, I'd wake up, I'd get ready and go out at 8 o'clock. And then I'd stay out all night until 4 in the morning, come home, sleep or not sleep, drink a shitload of Red Bull, and then go to work and do it all again. And I did that for days, weeks, months. It was also during that time where I started to do strength training for the first time in my life, where I started to do, I wouldn't say SBD, but I started doing squatting and deadlifting. And shortly after that, in 2018, was when I embarked on my last relationship, which was 3 years long. And during that time, I stopped going to the gym. And that relationship ended in 2021. When I ended the relationship, I ended up moving to Mexico and I felt very isolated. And that's kind of when I started going to the gym again. And it was also during that time that I got diagnosed as being autistic. And that helped me understand a lot of my behaviors. I went through this weird kind of like cancer scare, sick portion thing where I wasn't training for like 6 months. And then I finally moved back to Canada. And that's kind of when I started taking training more seriously. And pretty much the only time I left my house was to go to the gym or to get groceries. I bring the gym up so much because it is so fucking important to me. And it's enabled me to form really, really meaningful connections with people whose lifestyles really align with my own. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because having a close-knit circle and community is what ends up saving addicts. Because when you're going through addiction, you have the tendency, as I did, to burn a lot of bridges and destroy a lot of relationships. When I first started using, I was constantly stealing money from my mom to feed my addiction. I went through this process of taking her credit card, going to the corner store, taking out $200, walking to my dealer's house, getting $200 worth of drugs, coming back and hiding her credit card back in her purse. And I went through this fucking horrible period where I was constantly gaslighting her, stealing her money and gaslighting her to feed my addiction. And over time, I was able to regain my trust within that relationship with her, but I still keep my circle very, very small. And one thing that I wasn't prepared for when I got sober is how many friends I actually had. And before I got sober, I was under the impression that I had 30, I would say, really, really close friends. And when I finally got sober, I realized I had maybe one or two good friends. And while I was in rehab, not one of my good friends came to visit me. So sobriety will quickly show you who your real friends are. Through early sobriety, I was under the impression that I had the capacity to be friends with people who drank and smoked and partied all the time. And only in my recent years have I realized that I needed to align myself with people whose lifestyles and goals resembled my own. And I've talked about this before on this podcast, but I've always had a really difficult time maintaining friendships. And I had two friends for 13 years on and off. And there were periods where we didn't even talk at all, if it was for a year or two. But I always really, really loved them. And I always really wanted to keep them in my life. But as you grow and progress through sobriety, you're able to identify who your true friends are, who is really there for you and who isn't. And even if you have some people that do have the capacity to be there for you, sometimes the lifestyles just don't align. Now, I wanted to go back to something that I had mentioned earlier. In early recovery, I had a conversation with my mom where I had asked her to not drink and smoke while I was at her house for dinner a couple months after I got sober. And she ended up saying to me, why would I change my lifestyle in order to suit your needs? The reason why I brought this up is because people are capable of change in the way that my mom is the most supportive and loving and amazing human. And as I have grown and progressed throughout sobriety, she has as well. And we've both made mistakes, but that's what makes us human. I'm bringing this up because in sobriety, it's really important for you to identify who you want around for the long term, because they have the potential to uplift you and not drag you down. There's also importance in recognizing who is capable of change, but who is unwilling to change. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that your lifestyles don't align, and that's okay. Because there's also value in solitude. It's so much better to be alone than it is to be surrounded by friends and family who don't support you. Sobriety is one of the most difficult things that I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding because it's given me the life that I get to live today. And although it's extremely challenging on a daily basis, I never thought that I'd be where I am today at 11 years sober. If you're here and you're listening to this and you're struggling with addiction or alcoholism, you're still here. You're still here for a reason. And it's because you're a fucking fighter. And I know that because people like us don't go through this shit and not come out the other side being fucking fighters. If you want to get sober, you truly want to get sober, you have to be willing to fight. It's going to be the hardest fight of your life, but it's going to pay off more than anything else in the entire fucking world. And it's worth it. I remember I was doing a dark sport interview and they were asking me about sobriety and I guess the best things that it's brought me. And my answer to someone, I guess, who has never really gone through addiction would seem kind of stupid. But I said, it's worth it for the clean sheets and for the water and for my dogs and for drinking tea and for reading books and for having a bed and clean sheets and a washing machine and a dryer. And to people who have never really struggled with addiction, they probably don't get that because for the most part, those things that I mentioned, they're just standard necessities that people have. But when you're in the throes of addiction, when you are stealing and lying and cheating to feed your habit, and you get to a point like me where you don't have a place to live and there's no safe place for you that you can call home. And one of the biggest rewards of sobriety is having a place to live, having a place where I feel safe, having a place where I have the ability to decompress and clean myself and eat and sleep and lie my head at night. And I'm bringing this up because one of the biggest reasons that I attribute my sobriety to being, I guess I would say, as successful as it is at this age is my mom. And if you're listening and you're a parent or you're dealing with somebody in your life who has issues with addiction, I'm not going to tell you what to do because there's a very big difference between enabling someone and helping them. But what I will say is that the only reason why I am alive today and why I am sober is because of my mom. And when I first got sober, my mom got me an apartment and she got me groceries, my bills were paid, and I was able to have a clean living environment. I was able to eat food, and that's what kept me alive. A lot of people talk shit about being homeless, but they don't understand how challenging it is to be a drug addict and be homeless. And while those two things aren't necessarily synonymous, I mean, one has the tendency to result in the other. And in my case, I did not have a home because of my drug addiction. But it's really difficult to get sober and then not have a safe place where you're able to figure out how to live life and explore life as a sober person. It's fucking impossible. And again, I'm not going to tell anybody what I think that they should do because this is just my story and what has happened to work for me. But I think the two biggest things that I can attribute to my sobriety being as successful as it is having a place to live, having access to food, shelter, water, basic necessities, but also building community. And that's taken me a really, really, really long time. And at 30, it's taken me a long time to find my people. And although I have not found all of my people yet, I have found people whose lifestyles and goals really similarly align with my own. And I think that also in sobriety, as addicts, we have the tendency to, of course, have very addictive personalities. And I had to trade one addiction for another. And in my case, it became fitness. I became addicted to going to the gym, and I had to find something that was going to be healthy, but figure out how to make it sustainable for me. So if I can offer any final little bits of advice, it's that sobriety is easily the most challenging thing I've ever done. And if you're an addict, you can probably attest to that. But even as a child, I was self-aware enough to understand the repercussions of my actions and how I just didn't want to live that life anymore. And it became so sad to me. And on my 30th birthday, I was with my friend and we were talking about sobriety and how I'd gotten this far. And I was reflecting back on the friend that I had that had left me in that field that day. And we have a couple of friends in common. And I was asking about her recently, a few months ago. And it is, I think I would say 15 years since she left me in that field. And no hate to her. I mean, we were kids. We're all kind of just trying to figure out what we're doing and navigate life. But what I did find out is she's still doing the same thing. She's still living the same life, doing the same drugs 15 years later. And that just fills me with so much sadness because although it's hard to get sober, it is fucking hard to be a drug addict. And one thing that I say quite frequently when it comes to anything in your life, whether it's the decision to become more disciplined in the gym or start tracking your macros or eating healthy or anything that you do, you have to choose your heart. And for me, at a young age, I put myself through rehab every single time. Like when I went to rehab all 4 times, it was me making the decision to go. No one made me go but me. And I had to choose my heart. And for me, my heart was either getting sober, never having alcohol again, never consuming drugs again, and dealing with the repercussions and those consequences, because it meant for me that I had to confront a lot of childhood trauma. I had to deal with and actually feel emotions, deal with all my mental health issues, And while it's been fucking challenging and it's been fucking hard, I cannot imagine it being 15 years later and me not having changed. So if you're struggling, you need to choose your hard, because neither one is going to be easy. It's not fucking easy to get sober. It's not easy to confront these demons. It's not easy to repair all the relationships that you've fucking destroyed. But it's a lot harder to live with shame and live with the shame of bad past decisions. Confronting that shame was one of the most challenging parts, I would say, in early sobriety, but fuck. It's a lot harder to continue doing the shit that you're doing, burning the bridges that you've burned, and continuing to live life that way. And I was on the phone with my mom yesterday, and she was talking to me about someone that she met through this program at the Royal Ottawa Hospital. And it was a program for family members of addicts who were in the Meadow Creek program, the rehabilitation facility that I was in the fourth time around. And it was really hard because for years she went to these meetups with people, and I was one of the only success stories, one of the only people that actually managed to stay sober. And she hadn't heard from them for quite a while, I would say a few years, and she was on the phone with one of them. And their son was schizophrenic and still 11 years later had never been able to stay sober. And they ended up having to completely cut ties with him and cut him off. Because fuck, you can't just continue to keep people in your life that are destructive like that. So if you're struggling and there are people that you want to keep in your life, choose the right hard. Choose the hard that's going to benefit you in the future and is going to benefit your friends and family that you want to keep in your life, that you want to build long-lasting and meaningful relationships with, because it's fucking worth it. Again, it's worth it for the clean sheets. It's worth it for made beds. It's worth it for laundry. It's worth it for friends and dogs and books and hikes and beautiful things that I would never get to experience if I weren't sober today. And at the end of this episode, I just wanted to shout out my mom, because as I said before, my mom is the only reason why I am sober today, but she's also the reason why I'm alive today. And I love you, Mom. I think that's it. I think that this is the end of the episode. That was the 13th episode of 10 Years in Bed. If you are watching on YouTube, if you could smash that subscribe button, hit that like button, leave a comment, let me know what you liked, let me know what you hated, so that we can improve the podcast. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, if you could just take 20 seconds, give me a 5-star rating. It helps get the podcast out to more people. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for supporting. And we'll see you guys next Friday. Bye.